Welcome back, everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, Ed Balls. Ed.
Thank you to Mike and to John. And on a personal note, let me start by saying that while for many of you this will be another in a long line of politicians speaking today, for me this is actually a bit of a milestone. I first attended the CBI Annual Conference as a young economic advisor back in 1995. We came back the following year to Harrogate, just a few months before the general election, when the then Shadow Chancellor committed the next Labour government to price stability and to keeping the inflation target. I've been back to the CBI conference many times over the subsequent 18 years, but this is the first time I've ever spoken to this conference. So to Mike and John, thank you for giving me my debut today. And it's certainly a CBI conference being held at a vital and challenging time for British business and for the future of our country. We meet here with our economic recovery finally getting going after a protracted period of stagnation. And that return to growth is something to celebrate and to nurture. But with business investment still on hold, with bank lending to small businesses still falling, with youth unemployment still very high, with living standards still falling for most people, for whom so far there's really been no recovery at all, this is no time for complacency. There is no quick fix. We know we have to earn our way to rising prosperity, but we won't succeed unless we use the talents of all and ensure that everyone can benefit from economic recovery and not just a few. In my view, Britain has always succeeded and can only succeed in the future as an open and internationalist and outward-facing nation with enterprise, with risk and innovation properly rewarded, backing entrepreneurs and wealth creation, generating the profits to finance investment, and winning foreign direct investment from around the world. That's why Ed Miliband and I share the CBI vision of Britain prospering in a reformed global Europe. You are right to challenge us politicians to maintain British influence and to lead the debate about the reform of Europe needed to deliver value for money, a wider single market, and to secure rising prosperity. And Britain is better placed to shape Europe's future if we are fully engaged rather than leaving one foot out of the door. We are clear there is no future for Britain in walking away from our biggest market or from threatening to do so for reasons of internal party management. Europe needs reform, but to walk away from our EU membership would be reckless, foolish and deeply damaging. On Britain's future in Europe, the national interest must come first. But at a time when people in our country are seeing their living standards falling year on year, we can't take for granted public support for this open, global, dynamic vision of our economy in the world. I know as a Member of Parliament with, until recently, the largest membership of the British National Party of any constituency in the country, how some on the extremes of left and right see the solution to be isolationism, turning inwards, setting their face against the rest of the world and the global economy. They are wrong. Business is key to the solution, not part of the problem, as is Britain fully engaged in Europe. But at a time when businesses and politicians often seem to compete with each other for bad headlines, be that on expenses or tax avoidance or energy prices, none of us can afford to bury our heads in the sand and ignore the legitimate and mainstream concerns of people across our country that our economy is not currently working for them and their families. And that is why I want to say today, it is vital that government works with all businesses, large and small, to promote open markets, competition and long-term wealth creation, and to reform our economy so that by using and investing in the talents of all, we can deliver rising living standards, not just for some, but for all in every part of this country. Micah, this may be my first CBI Annual Conference speech, but over the last 20 years, I've worked closely with 5 different CBI Director Generals. Most recently, of course, with John Cridland, who's been attending CBI conferences for much longer than I have. To Sir Richard Lambert, who gave me my first job back in 1989 as an economics leader writer on the Financial Times. To Lord Adair Turner, who I worked closely with on the New Deal jobs programme and the climate change levy, recommended by the then CBI President Sir Colin Marshall in his 1998 report, which made also the case for extra help for heavy energy users. And of course, the unforgettable Lord Digby Jones. I was reminiscing with Digby last week, and I reminded him about the Secondary Schools Enterprise Challenge he came up to launch with me in Wakefield. "Oh dear," Digby said, "wasn't that the one where my speech got off to a bit of a bad start?" And it certainly did. He began a passionate speech about enterprise education to a group of teachers and 200 14-year-olds. And he started with a totally inappropriate joke about a lawyer, a pelican, and who could stick their bill where. The actual story was much more graphic in the telling. I looked out from the platform to see the faces of the teachers turning completely white with shock at Digby's joke. But I can report the 14-year-olds all thought it was totally hilarious and the highlight of the day. But let me say this about the work we've done over that period. I'm not going to claim we got everything right in our dealings with business, let alone that you agreed with everything we did in government or that we will in future. The CBI initially had misgivings about the national minimum wage, and we worked hard to show the low pay commission could work in a sensible way. And it's in that same spirit we're now working with employers across the country to promote, as Ed Miliband said yesterday, to incentivise a non-statutory living wage. On Europe, we were right to work together to deepen the single market, and we made the right call not to join the euro in 2003. And while, in my view, most British people do see and support the contribution that migration makes to our country, we were wrong together to support open access for accession country migrants to the UK in 2004 without transitional controls, without proper protection, without extra support for communities. And we all failed to see the dangers that were emerging in our banking system in the middle of the last decade and the inadequacy of bank regulation, and I have certainly learned from that experience. But time after time, when our economic policies were successful, whether that's record investment in rail and roads, a 10-year framework for increased innovation and science expenditure, cuts to corporation tax cuts, the capital gains tax for entrepreneurs cut to 10%. Those were policies which were successful because we moved beyond the old-style British debate, public good, private bad, or private good, public bad, and realised we had to work in partnership. And at a time like this, when we need to rebuild our economy for the future and rebuild public trust, that an open and dynamic economy can work for working people, I do believe that partnership and that long-term consensus is needed more than ever. I know it's not fashionable to talk in Britain about the importance of consensus, and let us not be naive, sometimes consensus can be a bad thing, as we all saw over the exchange rate mechanism at the end of the 1980s and the early 1990s. But I know how much business values stability and predictability, that it is the clear view of business that where possible we politicians should work together to build a consensus in the national interest. I know you will expect me to highlight my differences with the coalition today, and I will, but what I also want to do is set out where, on the big economic questions of our time, on banking, on deficit reduction, and on jobs and growth, that there is a consensus about the goals, and in places what needs to be done, upon which we can all agree. Let me start with banking. There is now a clear cross-party consensus on the need for higher banking standards. And we in the Parliamentary Banking Commission are urging the government to go further to entrench cultural change with a backstop power to break up banks if we don't see that change coming through. But we also agree that here, as in all areas of regulation, we have to take a careful and balanced approach. Too soft, and we risk, again, leaving taxpayers and businesses exposed. Too heavy-handed, and we risk throwing the baby out with the bathwater and ignoring the needs of businesses large and small. In my view, government should always study and remember the US response to the WorldCom and Enron scandals of the beginning of the last decade. The US Congress reacted with a heavy-handed piece of rules-based legislation called Sarbanes-Oxley. And it didn't work. It didn't stop the subsequent financial crisis, which after all started in the United States, and its complexity drove jobs and tax revenues out of the US year by year. This audience doesn't need me to say that rigid rules-based regulation is often not the answer, and that small and medium-sized businesses desperate for risk capital on fair terms are likely to be the losers if regulation is too inflexible and heavy-handed. We need to diversify and balance our economy, but a sensible and balanced approach must mean valuing our creative and service industries as well as manufacturing and construction, and that must include financial services too, which are vital to Britain's economic future and upon which thousands of jobs in Britain depend, not just in London and the city, but in Leeds, Edinburgh, Birmingham, Bristol, across the country too. The second thing that George Osborne and I agree on is that Britain needs a credible plan for deficit reduction. Of course, the contentious issue of the past 3 years has been the pace of deficit reduction and its impact on growth. The Chancellor set out to get the deficit down faster than the plan he inherited, but having choked off the recovery, he is now reducing it at a much slower pace than he or we planned. But what matters now is where we go from here, and we can all agree that the return to growth is welcome. But with the deficit and debt now set to be much higher over the rest of this decade than anyone envisaged back in 2010, there will be no complacency for me and the next Labour government on deficit reduction and spending control. That's why I said to my party in Brighton last month, the next Labour government will be very different from our predecessors. We will be cutting spending in 2015 and 16, not raising it. There'll be no more borrowing to cover day-to-day spending. We will have tough fiscal rules to balance the current budget and get the national debt coming down. We want every tax and spending commitment in our manifesto to be independently audited by the Office for Budget Responsibility. And we will have to make tough and difficult choices. There will be a cap on structural social security spending. We will have to go ahead with increases in the retirement age. I've told my party we won't be able to continue to pay the winter allowance to the richest pensioners. And because we've made tough choices about priorities when resources are tight, we are making difficult decisions on tax as well. After the financial crisis, I do believe it is right to repeat Alistair Darling's tax on bank bonuses to fund a youth jobs programme and to raise the bank levy to help make work pay by expanding childcare. And while we have supported, indeed we began, successive cuts in the main rate of corporation tax to make our tax system more competitive, down from 33% in '97 to 28% by 2010 and 23% today, we don't think we can justify a further tax cut for large businesses in 2015 when so many small and medium-sized businesses are under such pressure. That's why we have said the next Labour government will instead cut and freeze business rates for 1.5 million business properties, a tough choice made in difficult times when we have to use scarce resources to help those businesses under the greatest stress and pressure. And let me turn to the third area, where after the experience of the last 3 years, I do think the Chancellor and I now agree that we can't get the deficit down unless we have and secure economic growth. And that will now be the central challenge and debate of economic policy in the coming weeks and months. How do we secure a strong and balanced recovery which is built to last, which supports long-term investment, and which can deliver rising living standards for all and not just a few? Built to last must mean a recovery based on long-term investment, exports, innovation and productivity, which is why we share the CBI's concerns about the Chancellor's current reliance on boosting housing demand through a taxpayer-guaranteed mortgages to secure recovery through the Help to Buy scheme, while failing to take action to boost housing supply. The danger is, if you boost demand while failing to act on supply, you deliver an unbalanced recovery in which home ownership becomes even further out of reach for aspiring first-time buyers who see the price of homes going up and up. That is why we continue to agree with the IMF to urge the government to bring forward infrastructure investment to spend £10 billion to build 400,000 homes over the next 2 years. And it's also why we've urged the Chancellor not to wait a year, but to ask the Bank of England to review the details of Help to Buy, and to do so right now. For example, how can it make sense for there to be a taxpayer guarantee in a policy supposedly about helping first-time and second-time buyers, which is going to offer taxpayer-backed mortgages on homes of £600,000? Of course, what's going to deliver the strong and balanced recovery is investment. In the 21st century, the countries which will succeed are those who invest in skills and innovation, who can exploit the new and huge opportunities of the global digital network of the era of big data, the opportunities in high-value manufacturing, in digital media, in clean energy, in education, in medical technology. And the question is, how do we seize that opportunity rather than squander it? I think you know in your businesses that you can't hope to undercut emerging market economies like China and Brazil on cost and wages. We cannot succeed in the global race through a race to the bottom on wages and standards. That way is doomed to fail. That is why Chukwu Muna, our business secretary, and I, determined to learn from successful British business across the country, have asked Mike Wright, the executive director at Land Rover, to lead a review for us on how we can strengthen our manufacturing supply chains and deliver the skills and innovation Britain needs to succeed, small and large businesses working together with government in supply chains to invest and export. Some of you will say government should just get out of the way to make that happen. And where government is undermining confidence and investment, government should get out of the way. But on innovation, on skills, on planning, on infrastructure, for government to walk away would be to walk away from the long-term partnership we need to succeed. As Peter Mandelson, Lord Mandelson, said in his time as business secretary, ministers and markets can and should mix selectively and strategically. So to drive innovation, we will carry on with the technology strategy boards and catapult centres, successful innovations we started now being taken forward by this government. We will make the local enterprise partnerships fit for purpose. To promote long-term investment, we're studying the report of IOD Director General George Cox on his proposals to reform takeover rules and tax incentives. And we should use the planned resources from the increase in the licence fee for the mobile phone spectrum, expected to be over £1 billion in the next Parliament, to capitalise the British Investment Bank, so that region by region we can get small and growing businesses the finance they need to succeed. And following the path-breaking report by the chair of the Olympic Delivery Authority, Sir John Armitt, we will set up an independent infrastructure commission to end dither and delay in infrastructure planning and build the consensus on infrastructure we need to invest for the long term. Of course, the test of that long-term reform is how it would affect big decisions currently on the table. So let me address two. First, on airports. We welcome the Howard Davis review, and it is Labour's view that it should report before the next general election and not after. Under the Armitt plan, it would not have been possible to set up this Davis review without proper cross-party consultation or kick the report into the next Parliament. And if any future government then sat on the recommendations of that report, the ARMIT plan would give a clear remit to the independent commission to chivvy and chase that decision. Second, on High Speed 2, the whole purpose of our ARMIT plan is to ensure that in future the case for and the costs of any large project are properly and thoroughly independently investigated. Labour supports HS2 and the idea of a new north-south rail link because of capacity constraints on the existing rail network. But our support is not at any cost. The Labour Party cannot and will not give the government a blank cheque. That is what you would expect from any credible opposition, seeing a government desperately mismanaging a project. And that is what is happening here, with the costs having shot up to £50 billion. Indeed, the costs have gone up by a staggering £10 billion in the last year alone. So, of course, I welcome the Prime Minister's belated recognition that he needs to get a grip on this project. As you at the CBI have said recently, and I quote, "The increased costs of HS2 are a matter of concern. For HS2 to go ahead, it has to wash its face. The value for money test has to be properly applied." That is right. We agree, and we will put the national interest and the interest of taxpayers first. We'll take a hard-headed look at the costs and the benefits of the scheme to ensure it's the best way to spend this £50 billion for the future of our country. As Chancellor, I would be a strong advocate for infrastructure investment. And I do believe the government should be acting now to bring forward investment as the IMF has urged. But the Chancellor should never become a cheerleader for any particular project. Building a consensus about long-term infrastructure does not mean turning a blind eye to value for money. Let me turn to another area where we need long-term consensus to secure long-term investment, and that's energy. In your report, The Colour of Growth, the CBI made a powerful case for long-term certainty to drive investment and innovation and new technology. You call for a 2030 decarbonisation target, and we agree. But fully consistent with the need for long-term stability in vision, price and regulation, we also need an energy market that works in a transparent and fair way for households and business customers alike. And patently, it's not at the moment. That is why we have said we'll introduce a new, tougher and more transparent regulatory regime for what remains a highly concentrated utility industry. And while these long-term reforms to increase competition are being introduced, we believe it's right and fair to give households and businesses some respite with a 20-month price freeze, just as we introduced a one-off windfall tax to give the taxpayer redress after the post-privatisation excesses of the 90s. This isn't just to benefit households, it's deliberately going to benefit large and small businesses across the UK too. In my view, markets do promote growth and innovation and reward entrepreneurship. And when they are competitive, they should set prices, not government. But being pro-market and pro-competition also means acting when markets fail and competition does not operate. Otherwise, we risk losing public support. That is why I believe the CBI has been right to back tough bank regulation. It's why the CBI has rightly urged long-termism and transparency on pay setting. It's why the CBI was right to urge your members to sign up to your code of good tax practice. Our task is to show that a dynamic and open market economy can work to raise living standards for all. But when it doesn't, because competition or regulation or tax law fails, then business and government must work together to solve the problem and win back public trust. Finally, that's also why the CBI has been right to urge reform in one other area where we must work together to deliver and ensure all citizens share in rising prosperity. And that means getting all people the education and skills they need to succeed. Just a few weeks ago, my colleague, Chuka Amuna, published the first report of the Husband Skills Task Force. You told us that you need qualifications fit for the realities of the modern economy. So the Husbands Review has set out how government can give business, as employers sector by sector, far more control over the £1.5 billion currently spent on skills and apprenticeships. We will ask you to tackle free riding in your sectors and deliver an increase in high-end apprenticeships in these sectors and supply chains, including in all companies bringing in skilled migrants. And you will decide what qualifications work best for you and your employees. Just a few weeks ago, I met the chief executives of a number of the big IT companies at eSkills. They were talking about the IT diploma, which they designed at the end of the last decade. And I remember going to the launch of that in East London in about 2008 and talking to a very senior person from Vodafone who'd worked on that project. And he said to me, the point where I realized the IT diploma, which we had designed, was actually going to work, was when I was at a college and a head of computer science said, this IT diploma, it's a disaster for us. It's terrible. And the guy from Vodafone said, why? And he said, because we can't teach it in the computer science department. They're making us do it in partnership with business studies. And the guy from Vodafone said, at that moment, I said, Eureka, that is what we have always wanted. Young people trained in IT, but able to apply that learning to solve problems in the real world. And the IT diploma has been scrapped, and nothing has been put in its place. And vocational learning has been derided as a soft subject and downgraded by the current Education Secretary. That is no way to raise aspirations and spread education and learning to all. I can remember, just to end, that visit Digby and I did to the Enterprise Challenge in Wakefield. And I went back a few weeks later to see the winners. And the winners were a group of 14-year-olds from a secondary school in Wakefield who had, as their project, designed a plan to make Wakefield the rhubarb capital of Europe. A website, a visitor plan, promotions and projects, opinion polling. Wakefield sold as a rhubarb centre. They worked with a local business. They had this wonderful plan, and they won. And because they won the project, they came down to the House of Commons to get their prize, and we had rhubarb on the House of Commons menu that day for lunch. And I spoke to the head teacher of the school a few weeks later, and she said, you have to understand what this meant, this project. These things they did using websites, that bit of design, they discovered that people get paid for doing those things and that they were really good at it. And you also have to understand those three lads who won had never been to London in their lives until they came down to get that prize. Enterprise education opened up for them a whole new view of themselves and what they can achieve. And that is what we mean by opening up aspiration and using the talents of all. With rigorous modern qualifications, with enterprise education, with a focus on aspiration, I think it can be done. It can only be done, though, as in that competition in partnership with business. I hope on skills, on long-term investment, on building an economy which works for all working people, that we can work in partnership together. I genuinely do believe the future of our country depends upon it. And thank you for having me today. That's it.